What?
Record.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I do have a bad habit of forgetting that. Welcome, Erica. Yeah. Okay. All right. There we go. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about the spring feasts. And we are here with Ryan White, who is a teacher with his personal website at faithofmessiah.com, personal ministry website, but is also a teacher at the Tabernacle of David Congregation, Wisdom in Torah, the Hebraic Roots Network, Israel TV Network, Facebook. Ryan is pretty much everywhere you want to learn about Torah and Yeshua. So let's start off with a quick word of prayer. And I confirmed we are live streaming on YouTube also. Won't be able, if you're watching on YouTube, you won't be able to interact, at least not in the meeting itself. I'm assuming that it has the chat and whatever comments active there right now. But I can't monitor both of them. So unfortunately, you're on your own for the moment. So let's start with prayer, and then we'll get into the conversation. Well, Father, we thank you for your appointed times and for your resources, the ability to get together no matter where we are in the world, and to talk about you, to honor you, to praise your name. And I ask that you watch over our hearts and our mouths today. Give us your words to speak. May our words honor you. May our conversation bring glory to Yeshua. I ask in Yeshua's name. Amen. Okay, everybody. So as I mentioned, we're here with Ryan White, and we're going to be talking about the spring feasts. I don't know how familiar you are with the feasts. Depending on how you count, there are 3 or 6 or 7. It's terminology gets a little confusing at times, but the spring feasts are those that happen in the spring, obviously, with Passover, which pretty much everybody is at least a little bit familiar with, and unleavened bread, maybe familiar with, and FirstFruits, which is a little more less known, early FirstFruits, that is, because there are actually 2 FirstFruits, if you want to call both days that. The other one is Shavuot, also known as Pentecost, which is almost 2 months out from the FirstFruits, but it's still more or less considered one of the spring feasts. So Ryan, why don't you get started here, introduce yourself, or add anything that I missed. If you've got any ministry projects going on, I know everybody would love to hear about that. Feel free to point people to a website. So go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. This is a really big honor to be on here. So I'm up in Minnesota, land of the frozen chosen, and like Jay mentioned, I'm ministry is Faith of Messiah Ministries, faithofmessiah.com. Have a lot of stuff on there, and I do interact with a lot of other people. One of the big projects I have going on that I just actually kind of launched this last week or two ago is called Saturday Church Community. SaturdayChurchCommunity.com is the website. And it was really interesting because I'd found this software and I was like super excited about it. And I was starting to build it up. And then Jay, you contacted me like, hey, you wanna be on this? And then you're like, hey, check out this website. And it turned out it's actually the exact same platform that I was starting to develop, which is this community platform. So anyone out there watching who's not part of Jay's website, I would highly encourage you to go and sign up. CommonSenseBibleStudy.com, is that correct?
Correct.
And it's great. It has Facebook type features, but everything's broken up into different things. So very excited about, I really feel this is the next wave, is this being able to connect in a community where we can actually police it from the people out there who end up shutting down honest and real conversations. And I'm really big on just being able to have real conversations. I think too often we there's this vocal minority who think they have everything figured out, and they tend to shut down conversations because they think they have the truth. And anyone else who disagrees, their personal mission is to tell you how wrong you are. And I will tell you, I mean, I've been studying for many years. I've gone through a master's degree in Old Testament studies. It's not it's an actual biblical studies degree, not a what is it called, MDiv, or a divinity degree. It's actual, like, getting in, studying archaeology and stuff like that. And I can tell you for certain, the more you study, the more you research things out, the more you know that you don't know at all. There's so much out there, and we've got to keep an open and curious mindset and just say, you know what, I have the truth that the Father's given me right now, but the reality is that in 10 days or 10 years, something new may come along, and it may blow my mind, and I may be in a different place. And that's the journey. And that's a good thing to continue growing. So
I've had a couple of those just this week.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I spent a lot of time, reading and researching about the Passion Week and trying to figure out the exact sequence of events. And the Gospels are pretty ambiguous in places. And I thought I had it all figured out. So I wrote this long article and posted it online. Within weeks, I realized that I got some major elements wrong. So I tweaked it, fixed that. Maybe 6 months later, somebody said, "Hey, did you know this?" It's like, "Oh, I got that wrong too." So last year I wrote another one from a different perspective, more about Passover and, the biblical rules about Passover and how that relates to how we should do things today.
Yeah.
And in the last couple of weeks, I discovered that I probably have a lot of things wrong on that too. So it happens all the time. It's one of the rules at Common Sense Bible Study is that you have to assume that everybody involved in the conversation is trying to be obedient to God, and everybody might be wrong, including you. And if you can't do that, maybe just stick to Facebook.
I like it. All right. Well, I guess I can just kind of tee it off here with, I like to, before we get to looking at what Yeshua did in the Passion Week and how that connects to the feast, I'm very big on, let's look at the original text. Where does this come from? Which, comes from Leviticus, but also to look at the historical background, because I don't know how many of you have ever read in the Bible and you came across something and you're like, what in the world does that mean? And sometimes your brain, I've actually found this out, your brain doesn't even catch on. You just read it and you don't even realize anything. And then like the fifth time, you're like, you've read this so many times, and then that fifth time or sixth time or 10th time, or whatever, you're suddenly like, wait a minute, I've never read this before. And what does this mean? And what do I do with this? And the reality is that while the Bible is written for us, it's not written to us. It's written to people living 3,000, 3,500, 2,000, whatever, time period years ago. And actually, that's another good point to bring out. The Bible was written over somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 year time period. And when you actually look at the language, you actually see the Hebrew language actually changing as you get further and further in the Bible, all the way to the point where you start getting actually Aramaic mixed in there. Daniel starts out with Hebrew, switches to Aramaic like mid-sentence, continues in Aramaic, and then goes back into Hebrew. And then the Hebrew is this really chaotic Hebrew. And so it's this beautiful book that, again, it's written to this ancient audience, and it has these assumptions in there that we don't quite get because we don't live in that culture. Most of us don't live in an agricultural area. I've never grown my own wheat. I've never slaughtered my own meat. When I go hunting for food, I go to the grocery store and I get my meat at the grocery store. And so we sometimes we impose our own just kind of cultural assumptions on the Bible. And you've probably seen this often where people think that Leviticus is this gross and disgusting book because they're slaughtering all of these animals. And how could they be so cruel to animals? We say, well, we're eating our hamburger. And it's an interesting perspective because we live in this culture that has taken death, a necessary death, and we've sanitized it, right? We've put it out away from where we can see it. It's all cleaned up and it's all completely secular, right? You go and you kill it and then you get your meat and then you bring it into your home and maybe then you bless it, right? In the Bible, if we were to take our culture and take it back 3,500 years ago to Moses' time period, they would find it horrific what we're doing. They would say, how do you not have any respect for animal life? You're going out and you're having your meat slaughtered in somewhere without that connection to the divine, without that connection to God. So from their perspective, when they're offering sacrifices, it's really about, and the reason why they bring it to the temple and they do these rituals is because they have a deep respect for the life of that animal. And they are, the sacrifice, what the word sacrifice means, the Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words for it is korban, which means to draw near. And ultimately, it's a gift that's being given to God. You're taking what is yours, your animal or your first fruits, your wheat, your barley, whatever it is, and you are giving it to God. Now, how do you give an animal to God? Well, to the ancient people, the only way to give an animal to God is to burn it. And so, of course, you're not going to burn an animal alive, so you're going to do the right thing. You're going to slaughter it. And because the blood has the life in it, you're going to do the respectful thing, and you're going to either pour it out or you're going to take some of it and you're going to sprinkle it on the altar, making that connection to God. And then when they put that animal on the altar, it's interesting because I don't remember the exact word for it in Hebrew, but there's two different words for to burn. And in the Hebrew text in Leviticus, when we're talking about the sacrifices, the word that's used there is not the word that just means to like burn and consume. It's from the same word where we get like incense from. And so when they would put this animal on the altar, what they were seeing is more of a transformation into smoke. That's what they're doing, is they're transforming this animal into smoke, and the smoke rises up and it goes up to the throne room of God. They didn't necessarily literally believe God was, up there in the sky, but it's all about the visualization of it going up, and it's as if your prayers are ascending to God. And so that was one of the big things. That's why they would put their hand on the animal, is because they're making that personal connection with that animal, saying this animal is going to ascend to God's presence on my behalf. And so you would then, you put your hand on the animal, and then they would burn it, and then it was as if you yourself are being elevated to the throne room of God, so that you can have that kind of that personal meeting, that korban, that drawing near. Just absolutely beautiful connection there to me. The other thing that I really like to bring out culturally about the feasts is, and this is interesting, and some people can take this the wrong way, because we've been taught that, oh, we can't do anything like the pagans do. And so it gets to the point where it's like, how far do you take this? I mean, if a pagan drives a car, can you not drive a car now? There are certain things that are cultural, and then there are certain things that are truly pagan. And the reality is if you went and you observed ancient Israel's tabernacle, and you went to another nation and observed their sacrificial system, you as an outsider, having never witnessed either one, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You probably would think that they were doing the same thing. Now, if you were ingrained in that culture, you would immediately notice all of the various differences. There were very distinct differences, but on a whole, on a bigger picture, it seemed very similar. And this is the same thing with the feast. It's interesting that the ancient Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians were a little bit different because of the way that with the flooding of the Nile, but they actually did still have some of that same overlapping. But they all had essentially spring feasts and fall feasts, and they were all, and why? Because these are associated with the beginning of the harvest and the end of the harvest. It's a natural time for humans to celebrate. There's nothing pagan about the time frame. It's just simply, this is when the harvest is coming in, and what are you going to do? Are you going to be afraid because other people are celebrating during this time, or is this just simply, a time that you would be joyful? And so when God gives these commandments, they're already in this mindset that the world has been designed, shall we say, so that this is a natural time to celebrate. And what God is saying is, I love that you're celebrating, invite me to the party, right? It's this beautiful picture of every time that we have joy, every time that we celebrate, we shouldn't be doing this off in our own little corner. We should be connecting that to God. Everything should be connected to the divine realm.
Made me think of a couple of things that, you're talking about how similar the pagan religious system was to God's system in Israel. And I remember seeing some pictures of some Canaanite altars that had been dug up somewhere. And they look just like God's altar. I mean, they've got 4 horns on, one on each of the corners, got a crown around the outside. And that's what God told Israel to do.
Yep.
And there must be some reason for that. I mean, God doesn't, he doesn't design the sacred objects of the tabernacle just arbitrarily. There's a reason why it has these horns and the crowns and the, the gold plating or the bronze, depending on which altar. And these ancient Canaanites, they knew something about that. They had some idea of what the purpose of these things were. They knew a lot more about it than we do. And so they did some things that were right according to God's system. They were doing it for the wrong gods and in the wrong place. They weren't doing it right, but not everything about what they were doing was wrong, because they were a lot closer to that spiritual realm. They did live a lot closer to the elements in the things that the gods were doing around them, or at least that's the way that they perceived it.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the other observation I had there was, but
yeah, and I know that sometimes that makes people uncomfortable with seeing just those similarities, and what I've found, and I agree with, is that there's 2 potential lines of reason why there's this similarity. I mean, there's no denying that there was a similarity. Like you said, we found altars, and we have texts that describe these things. There's no getting around this. And so there's essentially 2 lines of thoughts, and I actually like both of them. I find they both have merit, even though one of them will kind of turn people off a little bit. But so the first one that probably everyone will like is the idea that God originally gave all of these instructions to humanity, and in the garden, or to Cain and Abel, or to whatever, and that those were passed down, and essentially the pagans took them and they corrupted them. And so when God gives these instructions, he's kind of doing a course correction back to how things had intended to be. That's really cool. I mean, we definitely see that there is corruption of things that are good. The one weakness that I will say is that the Bible never makes that claim that God set this system up and gave all these instructions well before Israel's time period. So that theory has its strengths and its weaknesses. The other side of things is that humans naturally developed these modes of worship, having just due to whatever, probably a lot of observation of nature, of how interconnected things are. I mean, human beings have an amazing potential to come up with things. And you think about, like, our modern worship, right? Our modern worship is nothing like ancient Israelite worship. They didn't go to the church or their synagogue and sing songs and do a prayer service or whatever. Their worship was very different, but that doesn't mean that that was the right way to do it. And this, we're doing it the wrong way and we've got to change or whatever. It's just, it was the way that things were done based on their understanding. So the other lane that's possible that I actually find equally beautiful is that this is how humanity had found a way to connect with the divine realm. They had developed these ways of worship, these modes of worship. And what God was doing is he was saying, I see how you do things, and I acknowledge that, and I'm going to come down. I'm going to, in a sense, incarnate into your society. I'm going to take what you have, kind of like what Yeshua did. He didn't raise us all up and have us hang out in heaven for a little bit. He came down and did what we did. He lived our life. He wasn't a first century Jew because that was like the pinnacle of religious society. That he came down as a first century Jew because that's who existed at that time period. And so he came down and became one of us and participated in our culture in those means, because ultimately what it's about isn't about having some sort of a perfect culture, but about that connection. And so it's possible on that alternative pathway that all of these things had been developed on their own, and that God is essentially connecting with us in a way that we can understand and saying, all right, you guys did this, we're going to do this, but here's how we're going to do things differently. Oh, you have priests. I'm going to say, not because there's anything wrong with females, but I'm going to separate it out and say only one of the sexes is going to be the priesthood, because in other cultures, when there were female priests, there was a lot of ritual sexuality in there. There was a prostitution and stuff going on in the temple. And the men, they have to, they can't climb steps. They have to walk up a ramp so they don't expose their nakedness. And all of these differences where he's coming in and kind of drawing us out and saying, these are the things that are not okay. So those are kind of my two pathways. I don't have a favorite necessarily, but I like holding. You'll find that as if you grow to know me a little bit, I actually oftentimes don't have like a firm opinion on something. I like to actually have multiple opinions, and I don't know which one's the right one. I like them both.
I can relate to that. In the comments, Carlos also suggested that it's possible Satan understood how God's system worked and how the Levitical system was going to be set up. And so he told his prophets to do things in a certain way as a deliberate mimicry of what he knew God was going to do.
Yeah.
I know that there are, I don't know if any of these ideas are legitimate history, but, I frequently hear about, mimicry of the idea of the virgin birth. This God was, they believed that their God was born from a virgin, died, and was resurrected. Some of that turns out to be just urban myth. But there may be historical examples of religions that believe those kind of things. But that could also be because Satan understood how God's redemption plan was going to work, at least in broad terms, and tried to create a counterfeit ahead of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's one story that actually is to me is just fascinating. And that is the myth. It's a true myth. Like, we actually have historical evidence of this, but obviously a myth that Caesar Augustus, his mother went and she had something, and she went into the temple of Asclepius, I believe it was, the snake god, and she slept in there, and the serpent came in there and basically had intercourse with her. And so Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, was literally the son of a god. He was born of a god, but he was born of a serpent god. And so it's interesting. So you kind of have this connection, but then that completely ties back to Genesis 3, right? You shall crush the serpent will bite your heel and you will crush his head. And so you see this person who represents the Roman Empire being in some of their beliefs the son of a serpent god, and here he kills Yeshua. I mean, ultimately, when we look at what was going on, there's a whole history there, but it was all political. And Yeshua gets crucified because of the Romans being scared of him. And so it seems like he's crushed, but in reality, Christianity ends up crushing the Roman Empire. So I like
Interesting.
that.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard that before, but I can see why the rabbis over time would identify Rome with Edom, and the serpent seed people. I'm sure would have a field day with that idea. We're talking. You're saying that you like to have multiple opinions about things, or at least multiple options, and not to hold on too tightly to one or another. And I can identify with that, and I kind of feel the same way, especially when it comes to things that are ambiguous in Scripture. If Scripture doesn't give us a very clear-cut instruction about something, and frequently it doesn't, then people like to, whether they've inherited some interpretation or they've come up with something, they just thought of it one day and they really like that idea because of some prophetic symbolism or something. They latch onto this idea and they're unable to see other ones. And the feast days are one of the most common places where people do that, especially when it comes to calendars, and is the Last Supper. Was that a Passover or not? Yeah, or was that this Galilean feast of the firstborn thing, or some other idea that I haven't heard yet? I have my own ideas. I have my own opinions on what seems most likely, but there's a lot of stuff I don't know, and like I pointed out earlier, sometimes I have to change my mind based on new information. And when Scripture is ambiguous, I think it's really important to be willing to be wrong. Can you give us a rundown of the spring feasts? Like, what are they? And I kind of listed them earlier, but I didn't really give a lot of information. Could you kind of explain what they all are?
Sure. So Passover, obviously being the most famous of that, this is found in the beginning of Exodus. You have Israel living in slavery, and they are living in this place where they're disconnected from God, and they're crying out in their pain to God, like, save us, with this idea kind of that he's not there. It's like you have this absence of God. Which is really cool, because at the end of Exodus you have this very real presence of God, like God's literally there on the mountain with them and stuff like that. And so they, as I'm sure everyone knows, because we've had the Ten Commandments movies and all the plagues and stuff like that. They're very popular in Hollywood. But you go through the 10 plagues, and then the 9 plagues, and then you get to the 10th plague, which is the death of the firstborn. And with this, you have God commanding the Israelites, and really anyone who, you see that there's actually a lot of people who join in. So it really was not just the Israelites, but anyone who was willing to latch on to this promise that said, if you paint if you slaughter this lamb, which, again, going back into the culture, to actually slaughter a lamb, like, shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. It was a whole cultural thing there. Like, they worship the sheep and stuff. So it was kind of like, you need to kill your own God sort of thing if you want to be part of this God. If they slaughtered this lamb and they would put the blood on the doorpost, Exodus 12, I believe it is, it's a little bit ambiguous at the first part. And it's led some people to believe that it's God passing over the house, passing by as he's going through and killing the Egyptians. But if you actually read it carefully, it's actually very specific later on. It's not that God is passing by so that he can go kill other people. It's actually, the word pasak means to hover. And later on it says, I will pass over you and protect you and not allow the destroyer to come in. So it was not about God passing by, but actually God coming in and protecting you from the thing that he had allowed to come in and slaughter the firstborn of the Egyptians.
in the sense of like a protective covering, like the covering on the ark, for example, because it's, the Hebrew word being connected to Kippur and atonement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Good connection there. So that's really what Passover is about. Later on, as time develops, there is this connection, and especially as Israel goes into exile, into the Babylonian exile, there becomes this connection to, they understood that the end of the exile, and even and realize this, that even when they had come back into the land, because they were still under foreign powers, they still considered themselves to be in exile. In fact, if you talk to a Jewish person today, even though they live in the land, they still consider themselves to be in exile. But it became connected to this idea of a new future Passover event that would occur that would bring them back from exile. And again, exile isn't just about exile from the land, it's really about exile from God's presence. And that's so key to understand. The Passover wasn't about them escaping death, or it actually wasn't even completely about them escaping slavery. It was about them escaping those things so that they could go meet God at the mountain. And that's what's so key with this whole thing, is it's all about meeting God at the mountain. That's where it culminates at. So you have Passover, and then they're told to flee Egypt. They have to pack up in a haste, and they leave. And so to memorialize this idea of leaving in a haste, the Israelites were later on commanded that for 7 days following that they were to not eat leavened bread. So that's where you get this idea of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So for 7 days, as a way of remembering that quick journey after the Exodus, Israelites do not eat leavened bread. And take that forward to today, and some people take that as actual leavened bread, and some people go to the point of like purging their dog food out of their house because it has baking soda in it or something. And so there's all sorts of varying things with that. First fruits, this was actually commanded in Leviticus, but it's not really something that could be observed until they actually get into the land of Israel and they start planting fields and actually having a harvest. So this is one of those things that's really not as much connected to the Exodus so much as it's connected to the entry into the land and giving God thanks for that. Now, as you mentioned, Shavuot, which is so Shavuot, there's a little bit of disagreement. You'll find this. I personally believe that the count starts on the Sunday following Passover. Some in Judaism, there's kind of a difference in belief, but most of them lean towards it's essentially first fruits, I believe, is the day after. So it's essentially 2 days after Passover. And so their Shavuot, their Pentecost, will be a little bit early, depending on the year. But again, kind of just a difference in interpretation. The scriptures is kind of hard to nail down. But it's a count of it's you count 49 and then the 50th day. And 49 into 50 is actually very significant because that's tied to this idea of the sabbatical year. At once every 7 years, you're to do this kind of economic reset. And then on the 50th year, which is called the Jubilee year, there was a complete economic reset. It was the slaves are released, and anyone who had sold their land gets to move back onto their land. And it was this huge event. And so you actually see in the numbers there's this connection to this idea of the Jubilee in this Pentecost or Shavuot. That's why it's 50. What's interesting, and there's the Bible doesn't actually say this, but it was Jewish tradition, and actually we can actually trace it as early as, I believe, Josephus and Philo, who were contemporaries with Yeshua, mention that they believed that Shavuot actually coincided with the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And I think that's beautiful because If it's connected with 50, with the Jubilee, with release, it comes really strongly into play, the idea that you can't be free without rules. A truly free society with no rules, an anarchist society, is not freedom at all. It's a free-for-all, and whoever's got the biggest gun is the true ruler. I've seen this before. Don't get me wrong. I mean, maybe this works in some places, but the couple congregations that I've been to where they tried to say there's no leadership at all, there was a very clear leader. That person just didn't want to take on the title of leader, but they were very forceful because they could be a bully to anyone who stepped out of line.
Yeah,
so
I think in any human relationship, somebody is going to be in the lead. That role might change from hour to hour, but there's always somebody who is dominant in any relationship.
And even, I mean, when you carry it forward to the New Testament, Yeshua doesn't say no leadership. What he says is you have this pyramid type of leadership, and what it actually should be is inverted, that the leader should actually be the one holding everyone else up. And any of us who have ever worked in a company where there's a power structure, you know that there's two different ways of doing it. It's either a pyramid like this, or it's a pyramid like this. And which one would you want to work in? You want to work in the pyramid like this. You know, I'm now the manager of an access center. We do patient flow for a hospital system up here in Minnesota. And as the manager, I will tell you, I put in more hours than my employees, and I don't get paid anything extra because I'm the one who supports them. Right. And that's what we have to learn from the whole thing is, if you want to be a leader, lead by getting your hands dirty and lifting those other people up. So, but yeah, Shavuot, giving of the Torah, giving of the 10 Commandments, and that's ultimately, I truly believe that the 10 Commandments are really about ordering society, that you can't, it's about forming and ordering society. You've got to have some set of guidelines to protect. I mean, that's really what the laws should be. I won't say laws are about, because there can be bad laws that don't do this, but good laws, what they're there to do is they're there to protect the vulnerable. I'll give you one example. The Sabbath commandment. The Sabbath commandment was not given so that the male, the head of the household, could have his day off. The Sabbath commandment, it specifically says so that your maidservant and your manservant and your ox and your donkey may rest with you. It was given because God already knew that if you have the means, you're going to take a day off. What he's actually saying is, no, you as the master need to make sure that those who are vulnerable, those who may not have the option to take a day off, you make sure that they have the means to take a day off. So if that means you pay them 7 days wages and only have them work 6 days, that's what you do.
Yeah, I did. I created a series on the weekly Sabbath and posted that a couple of months ago. For anybody who's interested in that, that's available with premium membership at Common Sense Bible Study. There's another course, the Chiasm course, that's there, and I'm working on one for the books of the Bible. Anyways, my intent wasn't to plug Common Sense Bible Study there, but as long as the opportunity is available. But one of the things that I really learned doing that is that, people talk about how the Sabbath is, they divide the 10 Commandments up in, the first 4 are, this is how you love God, and the last 6 are, this is how you love your neighbor. But the Sabbath commandment is all about your neighbor and your animals and your servants. And it's almost not about you at all. And it is in honor of God. I mean, he does say, "We'll keep a Sabbath to me." But everything that you're supposed to do involves doing good things for your neighbors, for the people around you. And really, all the commandments are about loving your neighbor, and all of them are about loving God. So that division seems a little artificial to me. I mean, I understand where people are coming with it because the emphasis is a little bit different as you go through the commandments. For example, murder. Murder is such a bad thing, not just because you're destroying a life, but because you're destroying the image of God.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, I 110% agree with you there. And I don't remember if it was James who said it, but somewhere in the letters in the New Testament, they talk about how can you cannot love God whom you have not seen if you do not love your neighbor who you have seen. And that's, I mean, that's just so true. And especially if you look at what paganism really was, like when he says, you shall have no other gods before me. Is it really about you having some other idol, or is it more than that? Is it actually about you behaving in a manner that is consistent with the character of God? Because that's really what worship was about. You worship Baal through exercising power. You worshiped Astarte through having sexual relations in like orgies and stuff like that. The worship of these gods was tied to specific actions and specific lifestyles. So while yes, at a surface level, you shouldn't be, worshiping God and worshiping Buddha, I don't think, in this day and age that there's many of people who really have that struggle. But what they do struggle with is where they say they worship God, but their actions are completely contrary to that.
Yeah. Well, I know that this is in one of the epistles too, and I can't remember which, but well, the idea is all through the scriptures, but saying that you believe in God and not doing what he says. Even the demons believe and shudder, but they don't do what God says to do. Well, I mean, on some level they do, of course, because they don't really have a choice in it. But if you have faith in somebody, then you believe what they say, which means that if they tell you to do something, you'll do it because you believe that they have either your best interests or the best interests of everybody in mind when they tell you to do that. If you don't do it, how can you say you have faith in somebody?
Yeah. Paul says that really well in Romans 2 as well. I believe it is, where he's just laying into, like, you who say you have the Torah,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't actually do what the Torah says, what does it matter? It's like the pagans who don't have the Torah actually are keeping the intent of the Torah. I mean, I doubt that they were, doing everything, but they're keeping the intent behind all those commandments, which was living that life that reflects the goodness of God, of how to interact with people appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every government on earth has laws against murder, against hurting people without cause. Almost every government has laws against stealing. So the basic rules of morality are built into our DNA, and it takes some practice to suppress that. Yeah. And if you suppress it long enough, I mean, Paul talks about that in Romans 1. If you suppress that long enough, eventually you destroy your conscience and your ability to hear that voice of God that's even built into you. How do you respond anymore when you've deafened yourself? Yeah. We're about 45 minutes in, and I want to open this up to any questions or comments. And I've got kind of a random one just to get started with. Sure. The later Passovers, after the first one, says that you can take a sheep or a kid from the flock. So you can have a sheep or a goat. What about the first Passover? Could they kill a goat for that first Passover? Or did it have to be a lamb?
I'm actually going to have to look that up.
I'm not sure if I've ever even thought about that before, but
yeah, I mean, it uses the word lamb, which is say. I'm looking this up in Logos software. So the word say means small livestock, beast, sheep, or goat. So from that, it seems like it could be either. I honestly, I'll be honest, I don't know enough about Hebrew to know if there's a distinct word between. Oh, actually, here we go. Verse 5, your say, it's translated as lamb, shall be without blemish, a male or female. You may take it from the sheep, which is the word kevasim, or from the goats, which is izim. So yeah, it could be a goat.
Interesting. Not a lot of application for that, but there it
Well,
is.
it's interesting you bring that up, and I don't remember the exact passage. It's in either Kings or Chronicles, or maybe both. But later on, it talks about offering up bulls for the Passover. And that actually goes to speak to something interesting, is that later on, when you get to the temple, you have the Passover, which is the individual household offering that they would bring it to the temple, they would have it slaughtered there. The blood would be poured out there, but then they would bring the entire animal home with them, because it was that personal meal, that connection meal. However, on the days of unleavened bread, in the temple, they would actually offer up sacrifices for the nation. And what's interesting is that they called those sacrifices the Passover as well. They called those sacrifices Pesachim, Passovers. So just kind of an interesting fact when we get into timelines and such, and supposed conflicts between the gospel accounts, is recognizing that the word, slaughtering, the term slaughtering the Passover could refer to the offering on Nisan 14th, on the day of Passover, but it could also refer to all of the sacrifices offered up in the temple during that entire week.
Yeah, that the Passover terminology in the Gospels is confusing at times. It seems like they use the phrase unleavened bread or the term Passover to refer to the entire week, the days before. I can't remember where it is, but it seems like at one point they even used the word Passover for the weeks leading up to the feast. So it all seems a little bit confusing, and that just makes those places where the Gospels talk about, when was the crucifixion, when did they have the Last Supper, it makes it all even a little more ambiguous. Every time I look at it, I find a new thing to be confused about. Elena is asking, with the death of the firstborn, was it all firstborn children or just firstborn males?
That is a great question. I actually had seen that, and I started looking here in this is in Exodus 11. So Exodus 11 doesn't necessarily, it doesn't state male or female. It does use the word bakor for firstborn, which is later on, it's the same word where we get bikurim from, which is where we get first fruits. It's hard to say. I will say the one thing that leads me to think perhaps it may have just been the males is because later on, when you have the redemption of the firstborn, and that was, the redemption of the firstborn. I don't remember where exactly this is. I think it's in Exodus, but it says that if it's the firstborn of the flock, of animals, that you sacrifice it. But if it's the firstborn of humans, then you redeem that with I believe it's a half shekel or something to that effect. You redeem their life with money, and essentially the Levites become the replacement. They're dedicated to God instead of all the firstborn of Israel. And so with that, there seems to be a little bit more of an implication there, this firstborn male. So that would be the only thing that would lead me to think that perhaps it's the males, but it's one of those things that's kind of ambiguous, and it's hard to say for certain.
Yeah, there are a couple of differences between when Scripture talks about the firstborn of animals and when it talks about the firstborn of humans. For example, when you're tithing the firstborn of your flocks, I mean, not you don't tithe your firstborn children, but when you tithe of the firstborn of the flocks, it's the firstborn of the female. So if you have one bull and 10 cows in your herd, well, then it's the firstborn of each cow that I don't remember exactly what you do with that firstborn. But with humans, if a man has 2 or 3 wives, it's only the firstborn son of the household or of the man who is redeemed, and not the firstborn of each wife. So there's some precedence for there being a difference between how the firstborn of animals and the firstborn of people are counted.
Yeah. And I will stop here and just say, I don't think that that's because God, is some sort of misogynist who thinks men are better than women. Likely this is because as a society, people valued, sons more than they valued daughters, and that the Bible doesn't condone that, but that is just a reality of that ancient society. And so likely, as you mentioned there, that the reason for that firstborn son is simply because that son would have been valued more. And it's unfortunate that is how people lived and operated back then, but that was unfortunately the reality for a lot of people.
Lane says thank you in the comments. If anybody has a question or comment, you can feel free to unmute yourself as long as you're okay with your voice being on YouTube and Rumble. Only mine and Ryan's video feed is going to appear, so you don't have to worry about your face being online if you don't want it to be. But go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. If not, you can raise your hand like Carlos just did. And you want to unmute yourself and ask Carlos?
Sure. Hey, Ryan, thanks for being here, man. Appreciate it. My question is, how does the feast, and since we're speaking of the spring feast, I guess we'll stick to those, but how does the spring feast relate to the Messiah?
That's a great question.
That's a big question.
It's interesting because I actually had this question from someone else, and so I've actually done a little bit of think work already with this. I had it just a couple days ago. I will say a place I was at 3 or 4 years ago was looking at things as everything is prophetic, and it's prophetic of Messiah, and this idea, well, the spring feasts were prophetic of his first coming, the fall feasts are prophetic of his second coming. I personally have moved to a different place since then. I don't look at the scriptures in a, and don't take this as offensive, but like a Nostradamus style prediction. I don't look at the scriptures as like some sort of a roadmap that if you can just unlock them, that you'll know the future and that the future is set in stone. So I don't look at them in that sort of a sense. However, the history repeats itself. History is very cyclic. I mean, that even people who don't read the Bible understand that history goes through cycles. And I do believe that we actually, I mean, this whole idea of the Exodus, we don't see that just once in the Exodus from Egypt. We actually see that before it's like the Exodus before the Exodus, right? You have Abraham who goes to Egypt, and Sarai, his wife, is taken, and then there's plagues, and he ends up fleeing from Egypt with his wife. So we actually see that pattern there, but then you actually see there's really great books about this called Patterns of the Exodus. You see these patterns of the Exodus over and over and over again in scripture, and it's a way for people to tell a story, right? And actually we actually see this sort of thing. African American slavery, a lot of African Americans have retold their story of being of being freed from slavery in in the terms of the Exodus experience as well. And so we tend to grab onto these things and latch onto them and relate to them. So that being said, Yeshua specifically chooses Passover as the time period to go up and provoke the powers, right? He was going to Jerusalem to die. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He was going up there to have a confrontation, and he specifically chooses Passover because of the significance. And I believe that it's so key to understand that the reason why he's doing this is because he knows he's going to die, and he's tying his death to the Passover and to the Exodus. And so when we talk about the fulfillment of Yeshua's fulfillment of the spring feasts, it's not so much that the spring feasts were all predicting what would happen at Calvary. It's that he uses this time period to show that his death is doing the same thing, but even on a greater level. It's what, and I'm not the one who came up with the term, but a lot of scholars have termed the new Exodus. And there's a lot of just stuff that's, I mean, it's beautiful in the Gospels. Like Matthew starts off with Jesus is he's in a village, and the king is going to kill everyone in the village, and so he flees to Egypt so that out of Egypt I can call my son. And then suddenly the next place we see him in the narrative in Matthew's story, like he's now grown and he's at the river Jordan, and now he's got to go under the water, just like Israel went under the water. And as soon as he goes under the water and he comes out, his baptism, the next place that we find him is what the Gospels say is at the mountain. It doesn't say which mountain, it just says the mountain, which of course reminds us of Mount Sinai. So that Matthew is telling Jesus' story, Yeshua's story, in terms of the Exodus, because he's trying to show us that he doesn't tell us what the cross meant. He shows it through his entire gospel, that the cross ultimately is an Exodus experience. The cross, there's many reasons for the crucifixion, and if you dig into what are called atonement theories, an atonement theory is trying to explain why did Yeshua die on the cross. And ultimately, what I would propose, I mean, all of them fit within some certain umbrella, but ultimately they all come to the Passover and the Passover connection to the Exodus. And the Exodus was about what? It was about freeing Israel from slavery to Pharaoh so that they could be free to worship God. What I would propose to you why Yeshua chooses Passover and connects thematically with these feasts is because he's doing something similar but greater. He's not freeing us from Caesar, because if we were freed from Caesar, we would just find another master to serve. He's freeing us from slavery to sin, to Satan. When you look at the crucifixion, you see that God has the power to resurrect, and so death no longer has its sting, and death is the one thing that tyrants have used to control people throughout history. And so he's freeing us from slavery to sin, to death, to Satan, and not just so that we can be free to do whatever we want, which is where I believe a lot of popular Christianity has gone astray, is because they've got the cross, they've got the crucifixion, but then they stopped. And it's not about being free to do whatever you want. It's about being free to now go to the mountain to worship God. It's about being free to now go to the Sermon on the Mount and live your life the way that Yeshua taught us to live our lives. So that's why I believe that there's that connection to the spring feasts and what he's doing there. Did that answer your question? Or I don't do answers, I do responses. I like to say that.
Yeah, I think you provided a different perspective than what that I'm used to hearing. But yeah, it makes sense, and it's definitely going to make me, like I said, it's good to be challenged by others, and I think we should be open to that and not stick to one way, because like Jay said, with time you start looking at things a little bit differently. And I have the same mindset where I'm malleable to be refined by by a set apart spirit, and by my brothers and sisters as well, because they bring a lot to the table. But you talked about the Passover, how he chose that, but is it the same thing with unleavened bread and as first fruits, because he rose in first fruits, right? So is that his way as well of saying, I'm your first fruits?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Remember what I was talking about with sacrifices, this idea of you're presenting your best to God, and when you take it, you put it on the altar and it turns into smoke and it ascends to God's presence. We see that same picture in Yeshua when they talk about him as a sacrifice. He wasn't a literal human sacrifice, right? There was no priest that cut his throat. They didn't take the blood and sprinkle it on the altar and all of this stuff. But it's that commonality in purpose. He dies on our behalf. He becomes the one who ascends to the Father's presence and all that. So yeah, you see that connection. He's the first fruits. He's the first one to raise from the dead. He's the first one to ascend to the Father. And then we actually see him ascending up. There was, I love the questions that the youth come up with. I had this one teenager once asked me, she said, we have this story in Acts where Jesus, he ascends from the Mount of Olives. And she said, what happened when he got to space? And I was like, yes, I love that. The reality is that he put on a helmet and he had already been walking through walls. I personally don't believe that heaven is some location up there, but I believe that God uses that imagery because that's what we connected with. And so why did he go up into the sky? Because that's what they connected with, ascending to the Father. And so, yeah, I mean, it's all about that idea of the first fruits offering ascending to God's presence for us. The unleavened bread, that one's probably a little bit harder to necessarily tie in. I know there's probably some kind of weak connections with, like, sometimes that leaven is connected with sin, but there's also times that leaven is not connected with sin. Yeshua uses a parable of leaven being representing the kingdom of God. So there are some connections there, but again, unleavened bread was a remembrance of your flight from Egypt. And so if on the cross we were truly set free from slavery to sin and death, I think that there's probably some connections we can make there to the idea that we now hasten towards that meeting with God on the mountain and trying to, I mean, it's like probably a lot of you, your first true experience with God. I was raised in the church, but I didn't really have a true experience with God until much later on in life. And it was like, as soon as I had that experience, I was running to the mountain. Like, I couldn't get enough. I was just, reading all I could. I was actually in nursing school at the time. And I remember there were several nights I just didn't sleep. And I was up all night. I went to class the next day because I was just so hungry for the word.
Yeah. No, thanks, man. It's a good explanation. I think it shows us that there's more than, thing is, we always try to find like one level of explanation for everything, when in reality, there's probably, this is the Father we're talking about, right? So he's probably working at different levels, different dimensions of explaining it, and our capacity, and it's good that humans have that, but we tend to simplify things to better understand things, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think and I've said this before, it is, I think we should get comfortable with getting uncomfortable, knowing that we don't know everything, and that's okay. So yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that I like to say is there are good interpretations, plural, but there's also bad interpretation. So I don't think that there's one perfect interpretation to anything. I think there's a lot of good ones, but there's definitely bad ones. And I mean, we've all heard, those, so we don't need to get into to some of the crazy stuff out there, but yeah. Thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah. Something you were saying about, how the feast may be prophetic of Yeshua and his role in the world, but not always the way that we think, and not cleanly. I mean, Yahweh is a God of patterns. Whatever he's done in the past, he's going to do in the future, but not always in the same way. It's not going to look exactly the same. It might not be in the same order, but it's going to be after the same pattern. And one of the clearest prophecies of Yeshua in all of the Old Testament isn't what we normally think of as a prophecy at all. It's not someone saying, this guy's going to come and he's going to be the Son of God and he's going to die and be resurrected. It's actually the life story of Joseph. And through all that he suffers, being falsely accused, and maybe not always falsely accused, but being abused by his brothers, put into the pit and brought back out again, sold to foreigners, and then being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and being put in prison and being resurrected again symbolically. But at some point in that story, his brother Judah comes back into the picture, and Judah starts taking on some of those roles of the Messiah. And the roles reverse, where Judah is now the suffering servant and Joseph is the conquering king. So this is reflective of Yeshua's role through time, but it's kind of scrambled. It's not a checklist of future events. And so the first time Yeshua came, he probably fulfilled all of the feasts in some way. He came and tabernacled among his people, for example. But all of those things are going to happen again. We will have another Passover with Yeshua, another unleavened bread, another tabernacles, another Yom Teruah, whatever those things mean in that future event. It's all going to happen again, just in a different order, in a slightly different way. I'm sure it's going to happen differently than anybody expects, because that's just the way that God seems to do things. I think he plays practical jokes on our theologians that way. He waits until we're all certain of what's going to happen, and then he, throws a huge curveball. But it's a lot like the 10 Commandments. You can't cleanly divide them into these honor God and these honor your neighbor. They all do both. In the feasts are the same way. Yeshua fulfilled them all the first time. He'll fulfill them all again the second time. And just as an aside, fulfill never means cancel. Daniel, you got your hand up. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yes. Shalom, shalom, and Chag Sameach. I just wanted to name some comments here. He was talking about the Pesach being a lamb or goat, and that's true. In Hebrew, the word Pascha can mean lamb or goat. So the blood of the goat or lamb on the doorpost is what was placed there. Now, the only reason they got the exception on the goat is because the goat was cheaper and more affordable than a lamb. Not everybody had access to lamb. Lamb's very expensive, even back then, and not everybody farmed lamb and not everybody farmed goat. So he gave options in that department, I believe, for that. What I do want to say is the whole point of the feast is they're shadow of things, like you said, they're shadow of things to come. Each aspect of each feast is about the Olam Haba, the world to come. And I believe that the Passover and the feast, that meal that we have on Passover, the Seder, is connected to the marriage supper of the Lamb, which, they leave an open place for Elijah at the table. And that is really not Elijah, it's actually Yeshua. So there's that aspect as well. And it breaks my heart every time I hear about that and think about that they're missing out on Yeshua sitting at the table with them right there at the Seder. And anyway, but we're all imitating the tree of life. And hold on one second. Yeshua is the tree of life. The Torah is the tree of life. Yeshua is the Torah in aspects and symbolic nature. And the reason I think the Passover is still relevant is because it sacrifices a bloody, disgusting thing. It really is. And God wants us to realize how important we need the tree of life. Before the sacrifices began, we had the tree of life, and with Adam and Eve. And when they sinned, they brought in the sacrificial aspects. And that is to remind us, I believe, of Yeshua as our tree of life, that one day we'll be able to partake of him in the Olam Haba, the world to come, and not have to deal with sacrificial things and killing animals and whatnot. But I think there are some sacrifices, if I remember correctly, still done. And I think in the end, but they're not lambs and goats and stuff like that. But the goat and the bull connection connects to Yom Kippur. Like you were saying, you're talking about Yom Kippur being atonement. The lamb, the goat, but the lamb wasn't offered during Yom Kippur. It was only the goat and the bull. And that's interesting. I didn't know about the bull being connected to Passover. That's very interesting. That was something I learned, very new. So, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for hosting us, Jay, and thank you for Ryan coming on and talking with us and learning some things there. That was very interesting, and I appreciate it very much. Very grateful.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
all.
Does anybody else have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I had a quick one.
Hey, Tim, go ahead.
Hey, you mentioned before about the cross and how the connection with the Exodus. Is that what is meant by the greater Exodus? I know there's a lot of really fun theories out there that I've heard, and your explanation of the cross and connection reminded me that kind of where I was that the people that are choosing Yeshua as a son of God, not going to get wound up in the saved thing or whatever, but pledging their faithfulness, believing upon, etc., are in fact taking that crucial step to separate themselves from the ways of Egypt and the slavery and all that system to the freedom under one master, one clear set of loving house norms as it is, and have that relationship. That was my question. If that was a greater Exodus that was mentioned.
So I'll come clean on it. I spiritually grew up with a lot of the greater Exodus teachings and stuff like that, and a lot of the interpretations of Revelation. I just to call it what it is, I don't look at Revelation as some sort of a roadmap for the future. I see Revelation as a continuing pattern, and that's why I think that every generation continues to think that they're living in the days of Revelation, is because it's not about one single event. It's about how history repeats itself, and we see this over and over again. That doesn't exclude there from being some sort of a future event, but I'm not going to put all my eggs in that basket either. So the greater Exodus, of course, comes into play there. I guess I say that the cross was the greatest Exodus. Whatever God does in the future, I think that there's still continuing patterns of an Exodus. I tend to struggle now with the beliefs that are popular in some circles that we're going to go on this that instead of a rapture, we're going to go on a camping trip of 7 years and walk across the bottom of the ocean to get to the land of Israel. Maybe, but that's kind of where I'm at with that. I will say, and I didn't mention this before, but one of the things that just really, for me, solidified that the cross was the Exodus is on the Mount of Transfiguration. You have Yeshua goes up to the mountain and he meets with two people. He meets with Moses, the leader of the first Exodus, and Elijah, who was the one who was to come before the second Exodus. And in fact, at Passover Seders today, Jews leave out a plate for Elijah, right? Because that connection with that. And the Greek is interesting because you miss it when it's translated into English. It says, and he was something he was meeting with them, and he was speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And I read that, I'm like, that's a really weird, like, I wouldn't say, hey guys, after this meeting, I'm going to go accomplish my departure and go to the kitchen and make some food. So when you actually dig into the Greek word behind that, the Greek word for departure is exodus. So he was meeting with Elijah and Moses, and he was discussing his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So for me, that was that really strong connection. I see that as what the prophets were talking about, but again, I don't think that excludes that pattern from playing out in the future. I just, as Jay mentioned, I'm 100% with you. I don't think that it's going to play out the way that we think. I think God's up there like, all right, I got all the theories, and now I'm going to come up with one that completely bypasses all of those.
Well, that's what he does in my life every day when I make my little plans.
Yep.
Can I wing off the subject for a sec? Ask you a quick question, as a personal question.
Sure.
What part of Minnesota are you in?
I am in Prior Lake, which is on it's a southern suburb of the Twin Cities. So I work in downtown.
I'm in outside Duluth.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah,
I've only made it up there once or twice, but actually I've been talking to my wife about going up there some more, and I've heard there's a lot of cool stuff up there to go see. Well,
I smoke a mean brisket. If you guys have any time, I won't kill the calf myself, but I'll do something. Then the biblical question that just hit me when you were talking about that the greatest Exodus is Yeshua and stuff like that. What did he at this point in your studying and stuff, what was he getting on about when he said you'll do greater works than these? I've again heard dozens and hundreds of lectures and this and that about different things pertaining to that, but it's kind of like you get 5 guys in a room and you won't get a conclusion.
Yeah. That's something I don't have I don't know that I have a perfect answer for, but I will say, so one thing that I've really keyed on the story, on the gospel stories, what I did is I took the gospels, I split them into essentially 2 to 3 chapters and created what I call the gospel cycle to kind of mimic the Torah cycle, where the idea would be to read through the gospels and the Acts on a yearly basis. And so I've been producing videos kind of going over each little section. And when I got to that feeding of the 5,000, that was, for me, that's what, when he talks about doing greater things than these, that's where it just struck me as so powerful, because he miraculously feeds, and it's actually more than 5,000. It's like 5,000 families, right? So he miraculously feeds 20,000 people. But he doesn't solve world hunger. If he has the power to miraculously feed 20,000 people, why doesn't he just feed the entire world? If he has the ability to heal some sick people, why doesn't he just cure all disease? And I think that, to me, that's where the "you will do greater things than these" comes into is that he intentionally doesn't do those things because he's calling us to do those things. That the feeding of the 5,000 at some level is a challenge for all of us to feed the whole world. And that's where I mean, I see, the homeless ministries that Feed My Starving Children. To me, things like that are greater things than these. Here's another one, is that in that day and time, there were no such things as hospitals. There was no sort of medical treatment because life was cheap. It was actually cheaper to just replace your slave than to try to get him cared for, which is why that whole story of the Roman centurion who went to Yeshua trying to get his servant cured was like, I mean, that would have been mind-blowing to that audience, because they're like, wait a minute, someone of this high of a level actually cares about another human life. And the earliest hospitals were all started by Christians. I mean, that was a movement an institution that we have today that, now there's of course issues with, because it's been commercialized essentially. But I mean, that's an institution that sprung forth out of Yeshua's ministry, out of a mindset change of human life actually matters. So that's where I go with that thought.
All right. Thanks a bunch. I appreciate the answers. I appreciate you being here. This has been a good class.
Yeah, good question,
absolutely.
Tim.
Really quick, I pulled up my PowerPoint before you were asking that question, and I did just drop in the chat the reference. It's in 2 Chronicles 35 verse 7 through 9, where it talks about the Pesachim Passovers were 30,000 from the flock and 3,000 from the bulls. So if anyone was interested in that actual reference point, it's available there.
Thank you. Any other questions? I know that there are lots of questions about the feast. So well, I've got one that may be, kind of toying with the fringes a bit. One of those questions that comes up every feast cycle, not just for the spring feast, but for the fall feast also, is how do you figure out the dates? And the big question among Torah keepers is how do you figure out the new moon? I'm like, when does the month start? And in the West, our calendars typically count the new moon from the absence of the moon. If there's no moon in the sky, that's the new moon. Apparently in the ancient Near East, that's not the way they did it. They did it with the first sliver of the moon. And I've done some reading about how Babylonians did it and how Egyptians did it, and there's a lot of commonalities. Pretty much everybody in the area counted their month based on the moon. The Romans were an anomaly, but they used to count it by the moon. They just changed that and started, their months got separated from the moon at some point. So the big debate among Torah keepers, Hebrew roots and Messianics, is should we be looking for the sighted moon in order to figure out when the month starts? Or is it enough to know mathematically the new moon should be here? So even if you don't see it, maybe it's below the horizon or, the cloud cover or whatever, we still know that astronomically speaking, the new moon happened at this minute of this day. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much how calendars do it now. I mean, if you didn't do it that way, you couldn't print a calendar ahead of time. So my question is, in the first century, how did they do it? I mean, Yeshua seems to have kept the same feast schedule that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were doing. I mean, he confronted them frequently about how to do it, or rather they confronted him, or he set up a situation where they would confront him about something. But as far as I'm aware, there was never any discussion about when to keep the feasts. So it seems like he was keeping the feast on their calendar. So do we know for certain how they did it?
Do we know for certain? We don't know for certain. I'll start off with that. What we have to understand the first century is we have Josephus, we have Philo, and we have the Mishnah, and a little bit the later Talmud. The Mishnah is written, and the Tosefta was kind of a parallel version of that was written, I believe, a little bit earlier. That was written pen to paper, I want to say somewhere in the 2nd to early 3rd century. And it was stories that were passed down. The issue is that when there's a war, the victors tend to be the ones who write history. Now, the Pharisees didn't win the war, but they survived the war, whereas all of the other religious political parties were wiped out. We have a little bit of the writings of the Essenes, because of the Qumran scrolls, that discovery. We don't have writings of the Sadducees, and we don't have even writings that within the Pharisaic movement. There was actually different sects within there, and some of those sects actually supported the revolution in 66 to 70 AD. And so really what we have is the memories of the people who survived, and people's memories tend to favor what they believe. And so what we have is the claim that the Sanhedrin was able to set the calendar. And there's scholars who don't necessarily agree. They believe that the Mishnah is essentially them giving themselves a lot more power than they actually had within the land in that day. That being said, whoever ran the temple, whether it was the Sanhedrin or whether it was the high priesthood, who was controlled by Herod and Pilate. Herod actually instilled, I think, 7 high priests. It was a very political situation, but they were the ones who essentially kind of controlled that sort of thing, and they would have set the calendar for the nation. And it's interesting that we don't have any, like, I've heard of, these claims of a Galilean calendar, which I've traced back to some scholars in the 50s and 60s, and basically they said, we don't have any evidence of this, but this is the only way that we can we can rectify the differences between John's Gospels and the Synoptic Gospels. So there must have been a different Passover date that they set. So they just invented this idea of a Galilean Passover without any historical evidence. We actually don't have any sort of historical evidence of any disagreements around the Passover dates. So it was very clearly set by someone, likely someone within the temple. And that's just kind of what they went with. As far as like bringing that back into our lives today, I actually defer to the late Brad Scott. He really influeînced me on that. And his statement, to give him credit for it, was, I think that God intentionally made these the references to the date ambiguous to see if we could all figure out how to get along. To me, I think it's not so important to get the date exactly right, but to actually meet as a whole community. I think God smiles when an entire community gets together, rather than when within a community you have 5 or 6 different people who are all doing on different dates because they can't agree whether it's the sliver moon or the half moon or the cheese moon or the sighted moon or the rabbinical calendar or whatever the case may be. Personally, I tend to just go off of the rabbinical calendar, but with regardless of that, whatever community setting I'm in, I honor whatever they have chosen to set as the feast dates.
That makes sense. And it seems to me that if the priest or the temple is functioning, you kind of have to go with what the high priest says, because you can't do the feast without the priest. You can bring your lamb to the temple if you want, but if you're there on the wrong day, you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah. There actually is one story that, and they weren't doing it because they disagreed on the date, but there were some people who would bring it way earlier in the day for their Passover slaughtering. not because they disagreed with the date, but because they wanted to skip the long line. They're like those people who, you know, camp at Best Buy before
Yeah.
the newest Xbox
They
or
brought their
whatever
tent with them.
released. And there was a whole debate over if they did this, if the Passover sacrifice was valid or not, if they tried to skip the line and sacrifice it a little bit earlier on.
Interesting.
So,
I think Carlos said he had another question.
Yeah. Last one for me, so we may be coming to the end, but I wanted to ask, you know, for those who are not in remembrance of the feast, like before, right? I had no idea of the feast. I also didn't really grow up in a church. I just think like you, I just started reading on my own, and you know, fell in love with it, and I just was like a sponge reading all the time. Then you come to all these feasts and you're like, man, yeah, I've heard of the Passover, but that's for the Jews. And, you know, wow, I've never heard of these other feasts. And then I don't know how many times I've read the New Testament before, like I was really studying it. And yeah, there's the Passover right there. How could I have just skipped through that and not really paid attention? So, you know, for others that you may come across that are not remembering the feast, remembering the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread and all these things, what would you tell them that why it's important to recognize and remember these feasts?
So it definitely depends on the person and the situation. I definitely used to be one of those Torah terrorists who were like, well, you're going to hell because you don't do these things. And if you really want God to love you, then you need to do these things. I don't think that is the right approach anymore. And I don't think I believe that God loves us based and as far as like looking at our obedience, judges us based on what we know. And simply because someone came up to you and said, you do this or you're going to burn in hell, doesn't mean you know it. It just means that you thought that person was a jerk and you probably blocked out what they said and forgot it 10 seconds after they said it. So, I mean, I tend to just try to share in a more of a non-confrontational manner of, hey, this is how I connect with God, and these are the things that I do. It's not about you should have to do this. It's more of a I get to do this sort of thing. Like when people hear about going to the Feast of Tabernacles for a week and hanging out with 1,000 people and just doing all sorts of fun stuff, like who wouldn't want, like that's not like a burden. That's like, hey, I got to do this. And I mean, to me, it's about sharing that. People ultimately, if they're going to keep the feast, I think that the strongest motivator is that they're joining a community of people who do this rather than they're scared to burn unless they do this sort of thing. And so if we are able to share, to create a community that people want to be a part of who does these things, the arguments drop out. I mean, I know, I'm assuming probably a lot of people watching this, go to church on Saturday. I know a lot of people who have stopped going to church on Saturday and started going on Sunday, not because they believe it's the right day to do it on, but because the communities that they are around that do church on Saturday or do synagogue, or whatever we want to call it, are so toxic that they can't stand to be there. And the only place that they can feel loved and accepted is a Sunday church. And so they'll keep the Sabbath as far as not working, but then they'll go and worship God on Sunday because that's the only community where people are actually living out a life like Yeshua lived out. So I hope that answers your question at some level. To me, it's really just showing people that the benefits of it and being able to show that from a community aspect, not just from an individual level as well.
No, I agree with you in that perspective. Thankfully, I did a lot of discerning and reading and hearing other people before I went to anybody, even said, you need to do this. because I'm kind of another generation of people that have come to this understanding of things. But I agree with you. I think it's better to tell them that it's when I practice the feast, it helps me get closer to him. It helps me understanding, his sacrifices and his love, and why did he do the things that he did. And it gets me closer to him. Every year that I do the Passover and unleavened bread, I learn something new every single year, and it draws me closer to him. While before, when I didn't do those things, it pushes you, like you said, I don't do these things because I think I'm going to burn in hell if I don't do them. All right. Like you said, and honestly, I do them because whenever you love someone, whether it's your wife or your family, whatever, you want to be as closest to them as possible. So as you do these feasts, you're closer to him than not. So as you go through the Passover and go through this meal, and you go through the exercise of the readings and all these things, the story comes to life more than it ever did before. Yeah. So because it's not just that one day as before, as some people used to, now there's multiple days where I so much want to be with him that I do want to have a reading for every day of unleavened bread, coming to the end. Like I do want to have that because I want to be closer to him. So that's what I would tell them if anybody asked me. It's like, yeah, you don't, it's not about, burning in hell or you're a bad person, because you honestly just want to have a closer relationship with him, better understanding. But thanks for that, Ryan.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That was a good answer and a good question, Carlos. That is ultimately why we do most of the things we do, is to glorify God and to bring more people into relationship with him. I think that we do need to wrap it up. I mean, potentially there is an endless list of questions about the feast, and we could go down all kinds of rabbit holes. I did create in Common Sense Bible Study, there is a controversial issues space. If you want to go talk about those things, I actually started a thread earlier today about calendar issues surrounding Passover. You are welcome to go and discuss that with other people, talk about your opinions, talk about scripture, historical references, whatever, as long as you keep it civil. And if anyone's not keeping it civil, let me or Paula know and we'll take care of it. Couple other quick things. We do a weekly Bible study online at commonsensebiblestudy.com, and that is available to all members. You can participate in. Right now, we're on the book of Proverbs. I think we're doing Proverbs 23 this coming Thursday, 7 p.m. Central. What else we got going on? I can't think of anything we've got lined up right now. I wore my American Torah t-shirt today, thanks to our local community here. That was a surprise gift, maybe about 1 year, 2 years ago. Heidi, who's on the call, had a big hand in designing that the t-shirt, and I showed up at fellowship one day and everybody was wearing one. Even with the toddlers had American Torah t-shirts on. It was that was an interesting day. Unfortunately, I only have a few of those left, and they're like triple extra large. So Ryan, if you want an American Torah t-shirt, I might have one that'll fit you. Not that you wear a triple extra large, but but you do wear a bigger size than I do.
I wear a 2XL, so yeah.
Ryan, is there a website you want to send people to? I know you mentioned that you were building a community on Mighty Networks also. And one of the great things about Mighty Networks is that through the same app, if you've got the Mighty Networks app on your mobile device, you can connect whatever communities you're a member of on the Mighty Networks platform. You can connect them all to the same app and just switch back and forth between them.
Yeah, I love doing that. I love, like, I can just, like, 2 clicks, I can jump over to yours and see whatever's come up. So yeah. So with that, first off, if you guys have any questions about what we talked about, or If you really want me to go into the have any questions, so I'll just call myself out. I'm the heretic who believes in the Friday crucifixion and the Sunday morning resurrection, and I do believe that there are historical reasons for that. So if you have questions about that, feel free on under that controversial topics section, just tag me. If you put like at Ryan White, it should tag me and it will send me a little notification, and I'll try to respond within a couple days, a week, whatever it is. So yeah, contacting me on there. Again, though, my main website where I have I don't know, 800 videos of teachings on there is called faithofmessiah.com. And then my mighty networks that I've just started building is called Saturday Church Community. So SaturdayChurchCommunity.com is where that is. And that, just for to call it out, I did set a $2 a month fee on that, and that's just to kind of help keep. So I tend to attract people who like to debate in a very mean way. So that's been my way of kind of keeping things civil. That way, the people who just want to come on there and argue won't do that.
Yep.
So
Thank you. Good stuff.
yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, everybody, I really appreciate you being here. You always make these conversations so much better than if it was just me trying to come up with questions on my own. So huge thank you to all of you for showing up and being part of this. And don't forget Ryan White's website at faithofmessiah.com, SaturdayChurchCommunity.com, and this community here, commonsensebiblestudy.com. And have a blessed the rest of your unleavened bread week, and go with God.
Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Shalom.
Thank you, gents. Have a good one.